Hello and welcome here to the CTA stand at AGRF, the African Green Revolution Forum 2019, which is taking place in Accra, Ghana. Today I have with me here a visitor, Antoine Bouet, who is a senior research fellow at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute. The reason that I asked you to come here today, Antoine, is that today CTA and IFPRI together launched the second edition of the AATM, the Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor. Yeah. So exactly 1 year ago we launched the 2018 edition as the very first. The idea is to have this as an annual recurring publication. Yes. Firstly, I talked to some of your colleagues a year ago at AGRF in Kigali in Rwanda. Has there been any progress or steps backward or any change over the last year?
Well, the release of this report concerning 2019 happens at a very specific moment, because in fact at the same time you have some trade wars and protectionism all over the world, in particular between the US government and China, and on the other side you have this African initiative concerning free trade, which is really important because it concerns 55 countries, 1.2 billion people, and
so the African free trade.
Yes, exactly. And this is something which is really important. And you have this contrasting picture between Africa and the rest of the world, and it's really different as compared to 1 year ago. Of course, we look at the trends in agriculture and Africa and trade as usual also.
And briefly, before at the very first, maybe can you just explain a bit why is this important? Why does it matter for those of us who are interested fighting for a food secure world?
Well, Africa has a lot of problems concerning food security, and in particular because the populations in Africa is increasing very rapidly. Today there are 1.2 billion people in Africa, but the African population is expected to grow to 2.5 billion in 2050. While the other continents, in Asia it will be stable and decrease after 2050, and in other continents it's relatively stable. And so you have a big population that you have to feed, and also there is a big increase in income per capita because there is economic growth in Africa. So it means that as the population is relatively poor, they will spend much more money on food, in particular to improve the diets, and it means that there will be a big expansion in food demand for food in Africa, and it's really a big concern because expect that the productions of food and agricultural commodity expands at the same time, but we are not sure that it will in fact expand at the same rate.
And one of the figures you read in the report is that of all the food exports from African countries, 80% goes out of the continent.
Yes.
So it means of all the food in average an African country sells, only a fifth stays within Africa.
Yes.
Which is quite stunning in many ways.
Yeah. So in fact the performance of Africa in terms of trade is relatively poor, and it's really a big concern. So in terms of regional trade, it's relatively low as compared to other continents. I would like to say that, of course, there are other explanations than trade integration to this low performance in regional trade. Why? Because, in fact, regional trade depends also on gross domestic products. If you are close to a big country with a large gross domestic product, you export a lot to this country. In Africa, it's different because countries are relatively poor. So naturally, I would say this statistics is relatively low. But even with that kept in mind, I would like to insist on the fact that there are many trade barriers in Africa, and in the perspective of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, they have to be removed in order for this agreement to be successful.
And another aspect when we talk about African economy, trade, it's often the informal sector plays a very big role.
Yes.
And the informal sector, that's also one of the points highlighted in the report, also plays a role in the international trade.
Yes.
Can you tell a bit about how the informal economy works in international trade?
Well, in fact, you have a lot of informal trade, which is trade which is not recorded by official customs. So either you have smuggling, that is to say, some companies that try to avoid official custom posts in order not to pay taxes, but you have also under declarations of trade in merchandise at the border. So it means that there is an involvement of custom officers, and you have also this trade in small quantities that happens in, for example, Uganda. You have people that try to pass the border with small quantities of foods, and it's very, very important. So in Uganda, it's depending on the period of time, it can be 25 to 60% of total official trade, which is really important. In Western Africa, it's maybe more important. For example, in a country like Benin, at the border between Benin and Nigeria, you have an informal trade which can be 3 or 4 times official trade. And in fact, the problem is that it is caused by trade barriers. If you have high taxes, if you have bribes which are demanded by custom officers, if you have export bans, people want to avoid this and try to pass merchandise without paying taxes or paying bribes.
So in overall, would you say the informal trade, international trade, does that play a positive role?
Yes, because what we are not okay about is all the policies that are impediments to trade. But if you have these policies, of course, informal trade play a positive role because it can serve as a food supply for people who do not have access to this food. And of course, it is also a source of revenues for people that pass the borders with this informal merchandise trade.
You have mentioned a lot of the challenges, so to say, that the problem with trading across countries, difficult policies, high tariffs. If we pin down, what do you think are the main challenges that are fairly easy to address?
Yeah. This is a very important question because, in fact, if you want the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to be successful, governments will have to address the issue of non-tariff measures. And so it means export bans in particular, import restriction, quantitative restrictions like import quotas, but also sanitary and phytosanitary rules and technical barriers to trade. And also, for example, rules of origin. What is rule of origin? Well, if you belong to a regional economic community, you have a preferential access to another country. If you want to benefit from this preference, you have to prove that the product comes from your country. This is what we call rules of origin. And you have several definitions of rules of origins, and there are several regional economic community and countries that belongs to different regional economic communities. So it means that the big picture of rules of origin in Africa is very, very complex, and it has to be simplified. So the African Continental Free Trade Area has to address all this issue, and this is the cost to pay in order for this agreement to be successful.
I just wonder, are they all issues to be solved within Africa? We talk about the trade within Africa, but of course also the challenge with goods and food coming often at a very low price from outside Africa, from Europe, subsidized food products. Which role does that play in all this?
Well, this is a difficult political problem. This is a political choice because, of course, it can fill a role of food security in Africa if people, in particular in urban areas, do not have access to cheap food. But of course, at the same time, it has to the food productions and the agricultural sector is a very important source of revenue for local farmers. what I would recommend, the best and most efficient solution is to facilitate for local producers the access to local markets. And there is a lot of work to be done in Africa, for example, in terms of improvement in infrastructure, in transportation infrastructure, of course the roads and the communications infrastructure. So this is a difficult balance in terms of policies to be conducted by African governments.
Just the last question before we end this talk. We have a lot of the challenges, you have some policy recommendations. Where do you think we are in, say, 10 years from now on? When we have the Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor 2029, what will the headlines be?
I think the most important factor behind that is political motivations and the existence of a real leadership. So if there is the political willingness to to address this issue and to make this agreement a successful agreement, I think that we will have a very important agreement in place and effective in terms of food security in Africa. So the problems is political motivation and the existence of a leadership, which is a question which is difficult to respond.
Fair enough. Thank you very much to Antoine Bouet, one of the editors of this year's Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor, which is an annual publication co-authored by IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and CTA.